Yeah, all right. Hi, it's Future History, talking about the 2020s from the 2120s. Going to talk about direct air carbon capture today. Big topic, really exciting. Going to just sort of tiptoe in with an intro, give some facty wacties you can talk about you out, and then at the end, we're going to discuss briefly where we're going with this and what exactly we're hoping to achieve in the very long run with carbon capture. First off, we've got to do it. So thing number one is, despite their great intentions, like really truly the best of intentions, in the early 2020s, there's still some people who believe they're helping, but really just kind of can't quite see yet how important this technology is. So some people think we shouldn't do it, and some people think we shouldn't even talk about it, because the main game right now should be getting the fossil fuels off the plate. And I totally sympathize with that, because the fossil fuel companies bamboozled the world for like 100 years, even though they knew they were screwing everything up, and they should have known better. They did know better. So they deserve to be kind of like ground into dust. And there's a lot of residual anger that is leading people to prefer to just stick it to them. No carbon capture because it would empower fossil fuel companies. Okay, unfortunately, that's just wrong. And the reason that it's wrong is that there's already so much carbon in the air that stopping completely is not enough anymore. So in the 2020s, we're spewing roughly 35 to 40 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. That's 1 billion tons of carbon. We're just getting started in the early 2020s with some carbon capture and sequestration, direct air removal of carbon, but it's only in the early millions of tons. So not close. We're going to have to scale it up by like a roughly 3 orders of magnitude to get to the really good stuff. So by mid-century, we've got to be getting about 10 gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere every year. And by the end of the century, humanity's got to get to around 20 gigatons of carbon coming out of the atmosphere every year. So it's not enough to just stop spewing carbon, although that's great. Solar, wind, fusion, space, solar, geothermal, lots of technologies are going to help make that possible. But there's already so much extra carbon in the atmosphere that we're still going to have to do something to draw it down. And of course, we can do that biologically with things like trees and other plants that sequester in their root systems carbon from the air. But the brute fact is there's just so much of it up there that we're going to have some technology on the problem as well. So the good news is we're already doing it. This is not some airy-fairy, namby-pamby pie in future skies technology. It's happening right now. There are dozens of installations around the world in the early 2020s. By right now, I mean you're right now, that are pulling carbon out of the air, which is awesome. It's great. Again, it's only in the low millions of tons per year, but exists, happens, it's going gangbusters, right? So there are two main ways they do this. One, they do it at the point of sale, like on the cap of a fossil fuel emitting spew stack, and they just like grab it and keep as much of it as they possibly can. Usually not all of it, but like a fair bit. And the other one is direct air capture, which is where you set up a bank of fans and you blow air through. It connects with a sort of filtery substance, which is highly dense and complex. Like you could unravel it to cover huge amounts of two-dimensional space, but it's these little weird pebbles. The carbon dioxide gets stuck to it, and then you heat it up good to slough off the carbon dioxide. And that heat ends up being actually most of the energy for the process, like 80-20 energy for the heat, energy for the fans, and etc. So most of the heat is the thermal process. And you've seen these fan banks probably now. They're like wide or quite tall. They can't be that deep because it gets quite energy intensive to get them too deep. So they're mostly like flat, skinny-ish tower things. So what we do with it once we get the CO2, one thing we do is we put it right back in the ground to burn as fossil fuels. Obviously not ideal, not the best way, not anybody's favorite way to deal with CO2, but it does happen. You inject it into an oil well and it comes right back out. I'm sorry, I'm so distracted by my flowy glowy locks and the time vortex that I'll really just make every effort to zoom right in on you for the rest of this. Obviously not ideal. Making oil with the carbon from the air is a bit of a circular process. However, it can still be a part of a virtuous cycle if you're using that fossil fuel to power your carbon capture technology, because then you're burning the fuel in order to generate the fan energy that pulls in the carbon and the heat that sloughs it off, and then you put it back into the fossil fuel that you're burning to pull it out, and you end up getting more out of the air than you are burning to do it. So it ends up being good. It's still better than nothing. And in the meantime, the other advantage to this structure is that it isolates the energy required for the carbon capture from the new budding technologies like solar and wind and fusion that are going to start to take over other parts of the economy, like powering vehicles and powering homes and lights for the roads and all that stuff. So that's good, because we want the grid to move toward energy independence from the fossil fuels. The second thing that they can do is they can sequester this stuff, so they can bind it with, in some cases, natural minerals that are in the ground like basalt. In other cases, they can combine it with mining the tin mines from the tinning mines of the earth. They can take things like magnesium oxide and some kinds of asbestos, interact really well with carbon dioxide, and with not that much energy you can fuse them together, and then you can use that stuff for sequestration, or alternately, even more exciting, materials. There are a couple other things you can do with this, but I want to get to materials. So you could make like fizzy cola with this carbon dioxide, or you could pump it into greenhouses to help, give the plants their atmosphere. It is, after all, the greenhouse effect, right? So you can use it for farming. There are other niche applications for this carbon dioxide, but the most exciting one, the sort of main event, is materials. And one of the key ones in the 2020s is concrete. You can already make greener concrete by using this captured carbon to create strong building materials. And that goes from concrete is quite a carbon intensive process to create. So it can go from something that, consumes quite a large amount of carbon to create, to something that's net carbon negative, because it actually sequesters that carbon in the form of useful material for building roads and buildings and other build related projects. And in the longer run, like later in the century and early in the 22nd century, that material can be the stuff of magical tech like graphene nanotubes, right? Because after all, carbon dioxide still has like a fair amount of carbon in it, and carbon, we know, can be an incredibly flexible and durable material. It can conduct electricity. It can also be quite strong. So good garments for space wear, and lots of vehicles and roads and buildings, and even cool spacey stuff like space elevators and Dyson spheres and, von Neumann probes and stuff. So there's like a lot of stuff we can do with this carbon. So the really exciting story here is, A, we know how to do this stuff, like we've got the technology to get this carbon, we just got to get it down in price a little bit, and B, there's like plenty of cool stuff that we can do with this carbon once we pull it out of the atmosphere. So that leaves really just like, let's do it, right? And if you're interested in the early 2020s, or if you're watching this shortly thereafter, you can go check out Climeworks, and I'll reach through time to put it in the description box here, CLIMEWORKS. They can accept a donation if you feel like contributing financially. Otherwise, you just help spread the word about them, or maybe you could even find a way to volunteer or just learn about the technology from Climeworks. They're not an affiliate or anything. I just think they're really cool. And again, they're in the early days of getting like a few million tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year, which is super important. And what we got to do is get that up 3 orders of magnitude to the 10-20 gigatons of carbon every year out of the atmosphere. And so I promised I would say where we were going with this, and I will land there. The ideal-ish amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we think, might be around 280 parts per million. So if you have like a million parts of air, then like 280 of those bits could be carbon, and that would probably be pretty good, because that's like roughly where it was for the last 200,000 years or so of human evolution, while we were putting the finer points on our Homo sapiens sapiens pre-AI, incarnation of our evolutionary form, which has, worked out relatively well, except for all the bits of the planet we've destroyed, but we're gonna fix it. And in the early 2020s, the parts per million are like 416 parts per million. So we've got to get that down to around 280 million. So the good news is in the 2120s, that's kind of what we're talking about. Like, we're mostly on it as a world. We're talking about like how to slow down this process that will have just begun in the 2020s. So this is kind of a good topic for the future history niche in particular of this 100 years, the 2020s to the 2120s, because in the 2020s we are just getting started with this technology, and in the 2120s we're starting to think about how to wrap it up with this technology and get it down to a smooth, sustainable level and essentially taper off our carbon removal activities, because at that point we won't be emitting very much carbon anymore. Where I'm from, we emit very little. It's a lot of space solar, a lot of fusion, a lot of wind, some wave energy, all the good naturally stuff. But that stuff isn't really the dominant force of energy in the human world until the back half of the 21st century. So first half of the 21st century is about phasing out the fossil fuels. But then the second half of the century has got to be largely about getting that fossil fuel out of the air where we put it. And luckily we can make really cool stuff with it. So that's about enough for today. Have fun saving the world. See you soon. Bye.